Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first seminar in our seminar series on the Middle East. It is my very great pleasure to present the speaker of tonight, May Darwish. Dr. Darwish is a lecturer in the international relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham. She was previously an assistant professor at the University of Durham, and she was also involved in a research network at the GIGA German Institute of Global and Area Studies. And there she worked on the international diffusion and cooperation of authoritarian regimes. Now, her research is, I think, super interesting because it really tries to bridge Middle East studies and international relations. And as you may know, very often the Middle East is considered as something exceptional. It's the region which did not democratize. It's the region where there are all kinds of myths and of assumptions about the Middle East that seem to justify this exceptionalism. And that has led to the problem, let's say, that rarely is the Middle East considered within broader consideration of international relations and international relation theory also. So she has published this super interesting book, which is called, I don't know which camera I should hold it up to, here maybe, which is called Threats and Alliances in the Middle East, Saudi and Syrian Policies in a Turbulent Region. We have it in the library, so I would strongly recommend to have at least a look at it, right? And read it, preferably. And she's the author of this book, which was published last year. And she has also published several articles in important journals, such as Foreign Policy Analysis, the Journal of Global Security Studies, Democratization, Mediterranean Politics, and Global Discourse. She served as a trustee of the Council for British Research in the Levant, and the British, it's basically a British Academy Institute that aims at supporting and enhancing research in the Levant. She also serves in the steering committee of the Project on Middle East Political Science, also called POMEPS, which is a network, again, trying to promote Middle East studies and political science. She has been since 2019 the director of the Arab Political Science Network, which is a scholarly collaborative initiative, again, that seeks to support, enhance research and teaching output in the study of political science, and in particularly on the Middle East and the Arab world. So thank you for accepting our invitation, May. Of course, it would have been much nicer if you were here in Bologna and we could have a chat also with the students, but the floor is yours. May Darwish will talk about threats and alliances in the Middle East. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, and thank you for inviting me to present. It's a great pleasure. And as you said, it would have been great if it was in person to meet you all and to actually discuss this in person. But I am sure this will not be the last time, and there will be many future opportunities. So I'm just gonna dive in. My talk today, it's mainly based on a book that was published based on my PhD and several years of research around alliances in the Middle East, but more importantly about questions of threat perceptions and how different regimes and states in the region perceive threats, but more importantly, how they make decisions about which threat they consider more eminent and more important to balance. And usually, I mean, every research starts with a puzzle, with a question, and that was exactly the case here. I was very much intrigued by the puzzling map of alliances in the Middle East. And I'm not the only one who got inspired by the complexity of how many allies, but also how different allies can change and shift over time. But more importantly, how one ally can build several informal alignments, which sometimes seem very odd from an identity perspective, but also from a balance of power perspective. And many people, like you can see now on my screen, are more intrigued to draw these maps and try to show some sort of patterns to understand how they make these decisions. And that's basically what I got interested in. And my research was mainly started based on the question of the Iran-Iraq war. And before the Iran-Iraq war, the situation was as follows. The regime of Saddam Hussein was trying to increase its military power. It had ambitions to assert Iraq's power as a leader in the region. And at the same time, the Iranian Revolution provided this window of opportunity because Iran, which was considered the supreme power in the region before 1979, started declining in military terms. Khomeini was not particularly confident that the loyalty of the army is for the Iranian Revolution, and they started decreasing its power. And at that time, in 1980, from this quote on the screen, the Kuwait foreign minister at the time basically was telling or was explaining the situation. He was saying in April 1980, an attempt was made on Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister, and there were some clashes around the Iran-Iraq border. At that time, Iran offered us to sell the Phantom airplanes to Kuwait. When we told them that we were not interested, they asked us to relay the offer to the Saudis, but they were not interested either. This showed us that Iran was not thinking of entering a war. And that was really the situation in 1979, 1980. Iran was very much busy with its domestic situation. And on the other hand, Iraq was particularly building its military power, trying to take this window of opportunity to assert itself. The question now is how different actors in the region perceived that situation. How they perceived Iran and how they perceived Iraq was mainly the most important, let's say, moment at that time. On the one hand, there were some states coming and saying, well, the rise of Saddam Hussein and his ambitions and his military ambitions in the region are the most alarming. They're threatening. They might be threatening the stability of the region. And that was the case mainly for Syria, situated on the border with Iraq, was particularly fearful that Saddam Hussein had plans for the region and his aggressive military intentions were particularly alarming and constitute an ultimate threat. On the other hand, other states in the region did not really see the situation similarly. They rather saw that the message coming from the Iranian Revolution rather is more alarming than the military ambitions of Saddam Hussein. And that was the case for Saudi Arabia, where they were, according to this quote in 1980, they were very much aware that Iran is not really interested in entering a war. It is not ready to build up its military capabilities, and it's rather very much focused on the domestic level. Nevertheless, they considered that the Islamic Revolution as such, with its attempt to inspire other movements in the region, to be the most threatening element in 1979. And based on these calculations, based on these perceptions, both Saudi Arabia and Syria, they made completely different choices in 1979 and in 1980. Once the war started between Iran and Iraq, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries started supporting Iraq, with the exception of Syria, which started allying with Iran in order to balance Saddam Hussein's military ambitions. And this story, or this episode in the region history, actually poses many important questions and actually can be the opening of several future research, and not just on this book, but it's one of the most fascinating periods because at that time, it was very clear that some states considered that the threat coming from military power was the ultimate source of threat, and that's the threat that should be faced, which was the case of Syria. Nevertheless, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, they didn't really consider the military threat of Iraq as the most alarming, but rather the identity that was presented by the Islamic Revolution, the message that was coming from the Islamic Revolution was particularly the most or the ultimate threat that should be balanced at the time. And this actually leads to ask, what are the sources of threats? Are threats usually ideational or they're material? And why in some cases identity might be driving the threat perception, whereas in other cases it's mainly power and military power that's driving other cases. Looking at the literature is as divided between realism and constructivism, the two extremes. On the one hand, the major work of Stephen Walt on the origins of alliances is telling us, well, states will consider the most sources of threats coming from aggressive military intentions, it's coming from the capabilities, the military capabilities, but identity and ideology will be secondary in their calculations. So Walt's balance of threat theory is typically explaining the case of Syria. It's explaining why Syria was very much afraid of Iraq in 1979 and in 1980, but it doesn't really explain why many countries like Saudi Arabia and other Arab states decided to side with Iraq against Iran at that time. The other extreme in the literature is the constructivist one, the work of Michael Barnett in Dialogues in Arab Politics, where he says, well, it's not necessarily about the material side of things. It's not about the capabilities and it's not about the intention, but it's rather about the identity. And it's the identity that shapes the perception around these capabilities. Again, this work might explain the fact that, okay, Saudi Arabia had this identity, but at the same time, it doesn't explain the case of Syria. Many other works emerged in the middle, trying to sort of combine or either talk about different elements of threat perception, like ideology or regime security. And most of the works, again, they either take one side of the phenomenon or the other, but they don't really provide this sort of comprehensive story that would put both together and explain why in some cases we have identity predominating, whereas in other cases, other material forces are more important. So in my work, I basically tried to solve this puzzle, how to combine these two elements, how to make sense of these variations across the cases. And I relied on several types of literature, but mainly I relied on realism and some elements of what is called ontological security. And very briefly, the ontological security is coming from a sociological perspective, talking about that individuals and also its adaptation to IR states have some need for stability. They have some need for having their self-identity confirmed, and there is a continuity and a constancy surrounding their material. So they know who they are and their environment, and they have some sort of routine in their relationship with the other and their outside environment. And on the other hand, there is physical security, which is related to the capabilities and the resources. And in the book, I'm saying, well, every state, every actor in the region, they have these two needs. They have a need for this ontological security, which is derived from their identity, but also they have a need for physical security. And they face threats and they face changes around them that might endanger one element or the other. And in some cases, their need for ontological security will be much more important. And in other cases, the physical security might be more predominant in their calculations. And that depends on two conditions: the fluidity of the identity, to what extent their identity is stable, to what extent their identity might be having different elements where it could change, where it could adapt, whether adapting their identity to the situation is easy and doable, and whether the material structure around them is clear. It's not constantly changing and it's not evolving with very difficult elements to read. And to show you how this works, and I'm really simplifying here, if you're more interested in how this works theoretically, you're more welcome to read more about this in the book. But very briefly, I'll show you this is in a very concrete manner in the first empirical case, which is the case of the Iran-Iraq war. And in 1979, Saudi Arabia was very much trying to establish itself as the leader of the Muslim world in particular. And at the time, they were just about finishing with the whole challenge of pan-Arabism in the region that was led by Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser, the secular project that was trying to undermine many of the monarchies, including Saudi Arabia. And in return, Saudi Arabia started to counter that with a pan-Islamic discourse, a pan-Islamic identity. Based on that identity, they're the leader of Muslim world, and to an extent, they have the support from the different sort of element or regions, especially the Middle East. And they started using also the Palestinian cause and turn it more into a frame around Islam. And at the time, they were very much comfortable in that identity. Nevertheless, 1979 was a critical juncture because the Islamic Revolution in Iran came with a very similar discourse by saying, well, it's not necessarily Saudi Arabia that should be the leader of the Muslim world, but other states could do the same, like Iran, for example. And Khomeini's message was very similar to the one that Saudi Arabia started promoting. So according to one of his quotes, Muslims must be a single hand, they must be united, they must become a united hand, remain united, become one, they must not think themselves separate from us. So in a way, the Islamic Revolution in 1979 created this very, very uncomfortable situation for Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia did not really have any other sources of identity. Their identity was very rigid, it was not fluid. There is a lack of a national identity. The whole identity that brings the state together is the loyalty for the monarch, which is Al Saud, and Islam, religion, that brings the different regions within Saudi Arabia together. So if Islam is not what really distinguishes them in the region, what else? And that was this existential question and existential challenge coming from the Islamic Revolution. So they were not necessarily afraid from the military challenge, but they were rather afraid that this undermines their existence, undermines their narrative and their image about who they are and what makes them distinct in the region. And at the very same time, the region was sort of also bringing different challenges. The balance of power was changing, the material variables were not particularly clear at the time. Where is the threat coming from? Israel or Iran or Iraq? There were many elements that somehow it was very hard and the changes was very fast. The response of the Saudis in 1979, 1980 was to align with Iraq. And that was particularly coming from this idea that their ontological security was particularly threatened. They needed to restore that. They started using sectarianism, the Sunni Shiite divide, in order to distinguish themselves. So they're saying Iran is a Shiite and we're Sunni. And to an extent, they started drawing on these divides in order to restore some sense of security, some sense of stability in their identity, and therefore supporting Saddam Hussein in the war seemed the course of action that would restore that stability in their own identity. On the other hand, Syria was in a difficult situation. It was particularly isolated. It was fearing Iraq. Iraq was rising in its military capability, but also the fact that Iran's Islamic revolution, coming in an Islamic term, did not necessarily disturb Syria's identity the way it happened in Saudi Arabia. At the time, Syria was adopting this Ba'athist ideology, a pan-Arab identity alongside with it, and always for them, the other was Israel. So this idea of the self and the other was not necessarily disrupted. On the other hand, Iran was saying we have to fight Israel as well, which was more or less aligning with the same view of the world in Syria. Nevertheless, Syria physically was very insecure. At the time, Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel, which was its main ally in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's gone. It found itself very isolated. And Iraq at the time was not particularly keen to support Syria in its war against Israel. And therefore, Syria was looking for a new ally in the war. And somehow the Islamic revolution provided this opening to support Syria in its quest for physical security against Israel. So in a way, they were facing this insecurity physically, but their ontological security was not particularly questioned. The only problem that was posed for Syria, the fact that Iran was not Arab and its Ba'athist identity was constantly based on the fact that they need to ally with Arabs against non-Arabs. And in order to change and adapt to this situation, there was a little bit of a change in Syria's identity over time. Redefining what does it mean to be Arab? What does it mean to have a Ba'athist ideology? So constantly, instead of just focusing on being a pan-Arab narrative, just focusing on othering Israel. So instead of just focusing on us as Arab, no, it's us and anyone against Israel. And by that redefinition of their identity and taking advantage of the fluidity of the Syrian identity in that regard, Syria was capable of restoring or working on its physical security and chose to ally with Iran against Iran. So again, this is just one example that can show us how these identity issues and material issues could interplay in one single decision, but also showing how the variation across cases. The book includes other cases like the Lebanon War in 2006 and how Syria and Saudi Arabia also made very divergent decisions. The same thing for Gaza in 2009, 2011, and 2012. But more importantly, this narrative or this argument is not particularly related to these cases. It could also inform more recent cases, like the Saudi perception of the Muslim Brothers after 2011. This is one of the most puzzling. The Muslim Brothers are also a Sunni group in the region. They are not necessarily challenging the Saudi claim of its leadership in the Muslim world. Nevertheless, Saudi Arabia perceived the Muslim Brothers as the ultimate threat in the region. And to an extent, this also confirms that Saudi Arabia was more threatened by similarity in its identity, which causes, or again, poses existential question around who they are, what makes them distinct, what makes them different from other actors in the region, and therefore they would perceive similarity as more threatening than difference. The same thing about the Saudi-Qatari rivalry in the region. Qatar, again, is rather a Sunni, but more importantly, very close to the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam that it is in Saudi Arabia. Nevertheless, divergence over leadership caused the rifts within the GCC in the last few years, leading to the isolation of Qatar. In general, these sort of discussions, as Rafaela was saying in the introduction, there is constantly this debate about to what extent the Middle East is unique. It's different. It's not really unique. It's rather posing puzzles and asking questions that could actually enlighten our understanding of international relations more broadly. This example of identity and power and understanding threats and alliances in the region actually tell us that issues of ideational and material, they're not either or. So using them as dichotomies, which is the way in international relation, usually simplifies the reality. And every international phenomenon has constantly both elements. They are more amplified in the Middle East, but they're definitely there in other places. And looking at these extreme cases in the Middle East definitely help us see things in a different way. But also, looking at these alliances from this different perspective allow us to understand some of the elements and the misunderstanding in the region in a different way. Like sectarianism, for example, it's full of misunderstanding. Most of the policymakers' understanding about sectarianism is coming from that the divides in the religions are driving the conflicts and they're driving violence in the region. But rather, the example of Saudi Arabia and Iran and many other examples in the region show that actors actually have an interest in forging these divides, in rather adopting sectarian narratives, because this provides them with security. It provides them with a sense of stability and continuity in who they are and how they define themselves in a regional environment that's very complex around them. So in many cases, sectarianism might be a source of security rather than a source of conflict in the region. And that understanding of sectarianism is not necessarily widespread, especially in the media or in the policy circles. Finally, if we talk about how can this inform other research and other puzzles related to alliances in the Middle East, after 2011, there are even much more interesting puzzles where also shows many elements of identity and power interplaying. The most important questions are related to non-state actors, which is also an area where the Middle East can provide a very rich pool of cases for understanding how non-state actors make alignment decisions, how they perceive threats, and to what extent can we consider them similar to states when they are taking these decisions. We're used to studying alliances from a state perspective, but do non-state actors like Hamas or Hezbollah or ISIS, when they decide to ally with other actors in the region, are they driven by the same motivations? We don't know, but it's definitely an important area to explore. Other elements, we actually very much focus on how alliances are formed, but once they are formed, we don't know how these alliances perform, what makes some of them survive and what makes others do not survive. Like, for example, the GCC and the Qatar crisis, why the GCC is sort of facing these rifts and divides after 2017, why it was very much coherent until then, and why this happened. But also the alliance of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas, which was one of the most enduring alliances in the region, has been also suffering some rifts, especially Hamas, that drifted away from the axis in 2012. What makes us understand these dynamics? Why Hamas was staying in the alliance until 2012 and then decided to take a step away? Again, all of these questions, they're full of elements related to identity and power interplaying. And again, it's a very, very rich pool of cases that poses more questions than answers. I'm going to stop here, and I'm very looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, May. Thank you. This was really, really interesting. I have already at least 3, 4 questions, but I will not start. What I suggest, what we should do is first take a couple of questions from the audience here. And for the participants that are connected via Zoom, I would suggest to use the Q&A, not the chat. because if I open the chat, then it's going to be on the screen, right? So Q&A would be more helpful. So you should please present yourself briefly, perhaps say also where you're from. And we will first collect 2-3 questions from the audience here, the non-virtual one. We say non-virtual, right? And then later from in the second round from the virtual participants. Okay, so who wants to go first? And I always encourage, in particular, the ladies, right?
Okay, hi, my name is Sarah Sharif, and I'm a second-year MA student concentrating in Middle East Studies. First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. And I wanted to ask, what's your take on the latest peace agreements between Israel and some of the GCC countries? And also another small question, do you think that Saudi Arabia will follow on their step? And if yes, why? Thank you.
Another question from the audience? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Carolina. I'm a first-year MA student. I'm from New York. I was hoping to go further in what you were speaking about sectarianism, because from what I've been studying about Lebanon in particular, it's always been characterized in that way. So I was wondering if you could expand on how you feel sectarianism could actually help with stability.
Here's another question, please.
So my name is Liv. I'm originally from Germany, and I am a first-year MA student in European and Eurasian Studies. Leaning on Sarah's question, I wanted to ask, so during the last couple of years, the Trump administration has been particularly close to, especially to Saudi Arabia, and that has shifted the relationship of the Gulf and the Arab Peninsula towards the US and towards Israel. What do you think is the future if the US administration changes this year or hopefully in 4 years?
Okay, I think this was 3 very easy questions, right, May?
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll take another round of questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you all very much. These are excellent questions, and I'm really glad I got the opportunity to actually discuss many of these with you. I think on the question, I think I will start from the third question backward. I think the question on the Trump administration, but in general on the US involvement in the Middle East in particular, this has been a trend that started with the Obama administration. And Obama had this view that the US involvement in the Middle East has been most costly for the US, and it doesn't bring as much benefits to the US interest. And the US interest could be rather achieved by empowering partners and allies in the region rather than being directly involved. And that has been perceived by many actors in the region, but also by other international actors like Russia and China and the EU, that this is a decline in the US role in the region. And even though this does not necessarily reflect a decline in its military commitments or in its arms sales or military aid to many of the actors in the region, it's definitely started a very important chain of changes in the region. Many of the countries like Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries, Egypt, they realized, okay, we're now on their own. And especially this was particularly, let's say, significant in 2013, when many of the Gulf countries were pressuring the US to intervene directly in Syria. And on the very last minute, the Obama administration actually took the decision not to intervene. And that was perceived by many of the Gulf countries that this was the moment where the interests of the US are very different from the interests from the Gulf countries. And based on that, they said, okay, from now on, we will have to implement our own interest. We have to look after our own security. And that started a huge arms accumulation in the region, especially in the Gulf by Saudi Arabia, the UAE. And more importantly, many of the Gulf countries, they felt that it's time for them to act on their own. It's time for them to take matters into their own hand. When Trump arrived into power, there were many, let's say, prediction about whether this is going to change, especially that he's sort of restored the good relations with Saudi Arabia, and whether the Trump will sort of bring the US back to the region in its full involvement. Nevertheless, over time, also Trump was unable to restore that. It was very, very costly, but at the same time, it was a train that started moving in a certain direction, and it was very hard to bring it back. Regional actors started perceiving the US role as changing, and based on that, they started making different calculations, different policies. And it's going to be the same after either Trump gets re-elected or not. Reversing that is going to be very, very difficult. And to an extent, many of the empowerment and the aggressiveness of several Gulf states, especially in the wars in Libya, the war in Yemen, is particularly driven by their perception that, to an extent, this is an anarchic regional system anymore. There is no hegemon. It's a multipolar system. The US is not going to intervene to stop or drive anything. And also that opened the door for more influence coming from Russia and China in particular in the last few years. I hope this answers your question. On the question of sectarianism, I'm not entirely sure I said sectarianism leads to stability. It doesn't lead to the stability in the situation, it leads to the stability in the identity. The actors feel more comfortable having a sectarian narrative rather than not having one. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, that was more of a case of international relations. But bringing an analogy to Lebanon, looking at Lebanese politics in the last few months, it was very clear that the elites in power were much more keen to protect the sectarian system, even when the sectarian system was not really the best, or that's what the people wanted, because for them it's economic security, but it's also identity security, that they rather would like to keep things as they are, stable, routinized, rather than dealing with questions that we have to reframe and redefine our identities in these societies. Again, the dynamics when it comes to sectarianism at the domestic level is not particularly the same at the international relations, because when it comes to international relations, it becomes more of a narrative and a discourse that's used to justify sometimes some foreign policies. But when it's at the domestic level, it's often tied to communities and tied to economic class and economic dynamics as well. So you have the identity also intermingling with material factors, more economic ones at the domestic level. So in that sense, it's not necessarily leading to the stability of the situation, but it's leading to the stability of the identity of actors feeling comfortable in who they are, rather than being questions about their existence and their identity in that sense. And the last question on Israel and the GCC, definitely this was, let's say, one of the moments that everyone saw that this was happening, or this was going to happen one day. But at the same time, nobody knew how this is going to happen or to what extent it's going to be received in the region. But over the years, the relationship between Israel and many Gulf countries, we knew that they existed. We knew that they were there and they were just happening. The fact that the UAE took that initiative is definitely bringing more questions about the UAE ambitions, again, to play a role in the region. on the one hand, the UAE has been raising its profile as a regional actor through the Yemen war, but also through the Libya war, and also trying to establish itself as a regional leader. And eventually, for them, taking that step, in my view, it's actually, let's say, a strategy to build its profile at the international level rather than at the regional level. So bringing about these peace agreements, it's not necessarily changing many things on the ground, but rather changing and building a new profile for the UAE at the international level. Whether Saudi Arabia is going to follow or not, I think I'm rather gonna not predict if it's going to do it or not, but I think eventually one day it is going to happen, considering the way things are evolving. But I think it's going to be more interesting to see how they are going to justify that, how they're going to deal with, let's say, these contradictions in their identity. Like, for example, when I was presenting the case of Syria in 1979 and how they faced that contradiction of allying with a non-Arab state against an Arab state, that could have been a contradiction in their identity that would cause some instability. Nevertheless, the fluidity in the identity of Syria allowed that change. Saudi Arabia still its identity very rigid. This idea of a national identity does not really exist. It's been developing and emerging over the last decade, but it's not necessarily there yet. We cannot really imagine what a Saudi is without religion. We cannot really imagine what a Saudi is without the Saudi monarchy. Like, the whole state is named after the family. So in a way, until they answer these sort of questions, a deal with Israel might put the whole legitimacy of the regime into question. So it would be interesting to see how they will overcome these contradictions.
Let me just quickly follow up on that, because on Sarah's question, because I was also curious whether you think that for the Emirates, this will mean some sort of identity manipulation now that they have an open agreement, normalization with Israel. Whether you think this is less problematic for the UAE than, for example, for Saudi Arabia in terms of identity manipulation. We were talking about the fluidity and so on.
Yeah, I think for the UAE, they were in a different position, because again, this whole religion is there, but it's not the only element in their identity. It's not like Saudi Arabia. So it's a little bit of a different position, but I think over the last 10 years in particular, the UAE has done a great effort in actually building a national sentiment, like the military conscription, but also using many of their local heritage in order to build some sort of cultural affinity to the land, to the different places in the UAE, building this some sense of loyalty beyond the tribes. And I think they have done this. Saudi Arabia started doing that, but very recently. The UAE has started on this very, very much earlier. And it's still, I don't know, I mean, the treaties have only started being implemented for a few months. So they started with some trade agreements, and it's going to follow on other things, tourism. But again, you know, how the people are going to respond that still remain, you know, to the reality to actually tell us how the public opinion is going to react to that.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So a few questions from the participants connected via Zoom. So one is from Brad Benton. He's a Middle East analyst at NATO. And his question is, at what point would you argue Pan-Arabism failed as an identity movement? And then there is a question from Davide Tabarelli, who asks, is there a new vision about the past from the growing number of young people in the Middle East on both sides of the Gulf? And David Tabarelli is from Numisma Energia. Let me see. And then from Fadi Abdel Latif, who writes, I would like to thank Dr. May for her presentation analysis. I noticed that this analysis did not consider external factors like interventions and pressures posed by Western country. What's your take on this? So again, three very simple questions, right? I mean, I'll just answer them in 3 words, right?
All right. Well, thank you very much. So the first question by Brad, I mean, definitely Pan-Arabism has failed as a political project. There's no doubt about that. But whether it's it wasn't just a political project, there was also the cultural side of it. And until very recently, until 2011, the first year from 2011 till 2012, it was very visible that Pan-Arabism remains culturally alive, and that there is a solidarity across the Arab world, across different parts of the region, that, you know, a movement and a protest in Tunisia inspired a protest in Egypt, inspired other protests in the other parts of the Arab world. And there is a very good article by our colleague Martin Valbjorn and Andre Bank about this, about how Pan-Arabism was actually rediscovered in that moment as a cultural factor. And it was mainly about the people, that even though the elites stopped believing in Pan-Arabism, it was still a very much present identity at the public opinion, and it was still driving some political dynamics. Unfortunately, after 2012, this died, and to an extent it left a void for other dynamics. One of them are sectarianism, but also the domestic politics. Every Arab people became much more absorbed by what was happening in their own country, by their political struggles, economic struggles after 2012, that this moment that brought all of them together almost disappeared. So that would be my response. Whether Pan-Arabism or the Arab cultural element might be revived again, it could be. It could be. It's like many identities, they are activated and deactivated over time. Like sectarianism, it was always there, but it became politicized at a particular point in time because the conditions allowed it. And the same thing for Pan-Arabism, it might be deactivated for a while and then reactivated again. And that's the nature of identities, the way we see them politically. The second question, is there a new vision about the past from the growing number of young people? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I'm guessing that you're talking more about whether young people in the Middle East have a different view of the past. They have a different reading of the past. I do think, in a way, the young people at that point in history, if they haven't lived these moments, they have a different reading. Like, I give you a very simple example. In Egypt, the Yemen War. Egypt was involved in the Yemen War for 5 years, from 1962 until 1967. And it was one of the most shameful episode in Egyptian history. And this episode, for those generations who were not living at that moment, they hardly know that Egypt was ever involved in Yemen. And they don't study it in history. It's banned from the public debates, from public spheres. Books are not allowed to be published on that. So there is a ban from the army on discussing these issues. And the result that you've got whole new generations that they don't even know about this episode. The same thing about many other people in the region. Sometimes the control over the narratives of the past are much more powerful than we think. So in a way, their vision of these past moments are often shaped by what they study in school, what the curriculum tells them. After 2011 and the internet, social media, has provided a new outlet for people to actually seek information that was not particularly available before. How it's shaping the public opinion, it's not necessarily for the better, but it's definitely providing a new element of interaction for people to revisit their history in different ways. And then Fadi's question, it's spot on. I think this is an excellent question. And I think I talk a little bit about it in the book in the end, that this is one of the limitations of my analysis, that I do not include the external factors, which are often very, very significant and very influential in shaping many of the variables, many of the calculations in actors' threat perceptions and decision-making. And at the time, I think, this idea that the Middle East is a penetrated system, these constant interventions from the outside, from the US and great powers, has been shaping the region in many ways, or the lack thereof. So even when we saw that the US is not willing to intervene in the region, also spiked a whole set of events and dynamics and cycles of change in the region. So definitely this is a very, very important element. And the Iran-Iraq war is an example where the US actually was influential in supporting Saddam Hussein's, but also the Iran-Contra scandal afterwards, where it was found that the US was also providing Khomeini with arms and supporting it indirectly. So in a way, it was very influential and it was always there. Nevertheless, the book was much more focused on actors, regional actors and regional wars, in the sense where what was really driving their motivation, what was really driving their thinking behind these decisions.
Thank you. Questions? Sean, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. My name is John. I'm from Turkey. I had a question about ontological instability and the discomfort caused by this. Could you elaborate a bit more on this? I understand how this can cause discomfort, but why exactly? Is it a question of international relations not being able to be a regional leader, or is it more about domestic political stability and controlling that, or is the more widespread sense of coherence, maybe even at the subconscious level of the leaders in all their actions?
Other questions? Yes, in the back, please.
Hello. Do you believe that if Iran successful in obtaining a nuclear bomb, that it will ensure the Saudis pursue their own nuclear weapons program?
Could you please quickly say who you are?
Oh, sorry, I'm Connor O'Brien. I'm a first-year MA student studying American foreign policy.
Thank you. So would you like to, I have another question. I don't know whether I should add it now or later. Should I go?
As you wish, of course, welcome.
I have actually a question. I mean, first of all, a comment, because while I was recently rereading Wald's Origin of Alliances, the whole issue of the balance of threats, I thought that actually it is perhaps not totally correct to put him into the neo-realist camp, because actually the moment that you start talking about threats and balancing threats, you already open the door to constructivism, right? Because the question is then how, exactly your question, how are threats actually constructed? I mean, which threat do you perceive as being more threatening than others, right? That was just a quick comment. My question is whether authoritarianism figures in your analysis. Now, I know this is, of course, a very tricky question, because it is tricky at different levels. It is difficult because this type of identity manipulations that you sometimes describe in your book, so you just adjust, right? And if the situation changes, you try to adjust the identity discourse. of course, it is very difficult to know whether populations actually identify with that, if it's the regime doing this manipulation, right? I mean, we may know later when everything explodes, but we don't know at the moment, right? So I was thinking in general whether anything of your analysis can actually be transferred to other places, or whether how strong does this authoritarianism, is that a variable in your analysis or not?
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. So starting with the first question on ontological security, it's a whole field and it's an emerging literature in IR. So if you're interested, definitely you're welcome to explore this more. But very briefly, it's coming from Anthony Giddens' work on ontological security. And his work was mainly about the individual. So the individual as a person, you can look at yourself in the mirror and you can say, okay, what defines me? What makes me different from a different person? If you're introducing yourself, how are you going to introduce yourself? And there are some critical situation in an individual life where you have a crisis, you have an identity crisis. Like you hear of this person, you know, is going through a crisis because maybe he's put in a situation where his identity is being questioned or his values are being questioned. And then he has to find some sort of balance. He has to restore that balance. And bringing the same concept, the same understanding of this to state level by saying, well, the state system is like a society, and every state is behaving as, you know, as an individual among others, trying to identify itself, find itself an identity. And this identity needs to be communicated to the outside, but also to the inside, as you were talking about the domestic. So the people have to identify themselves, like national identities. This is a way of saying, okay, that's who we are, that what mobilize a whole nation behind a narrative. So in a way, you've got this sort of dynamic, but then like individuals go through crises, states can go through crisis. There might be a situation where they realized, okay, our identity is being questioned. It could come from domestic crisis, like a protest. People are not really accepting what the national narrative is about, but it could be also from the outside, like the case of Saudi Arabia, for example, that all of the sudden they woke up the following morning, they were claiming that they're the only leader of the Muslim world, to find another state claiming exactly the same. How they're going to do that, how they're going to make that difference, how they're going to justify that they're the legitimate leader of the Muslim world. So in a way that put them in a situation that they had to question who they are, how they're going to, you know, drive a narrative that it's saying, well, it's not Iran, it's actually us. They didn't have to do that before. It was very clear that all the regions around them, or all the states around them, they were pan-Arabs. They were saying we're secular. So they didn't face that dilemma. Iran even was not really, before 1979, it was all about the Persian nationalism. So at that time, it was very clear to make that distinction. So the fact that another state was claiming exactly the same made them question their own identity. And therefore, this stability about who they are, about what they're communicating to their own people, but also to the outside world, had to be revised. And therefore, they found, for example, the answer in sectarianism by saying, well, they're Shia, we're Muslim. That's the difference. So in a way, that's sectarianism provided the answer to that question. And there are many other cases where, if you're interested in reading more about it, there are questions where the ontological security is facing dissonance, where states found themselves that they had to behave in a certain way that contradicts their identity. For example, they're claiming that they are, you know, nationalist in a particular way, and then they have to follow a foreign policy that it's basically totally the opposite of what they're saying. And there are many, many examples in international relations that way. But that's also another example of ontological security, where states are actually facing questions and they have to answer these questions. Otherwise, the leaders might lose legitimacy, but also people would not believe in the idea of the state anymore. On the question of the nuclear bomb, I think there is a book that I could recommend. It's actually talking exactly about that question, about how the nuclear threat of Iran, that Iran, if Iran reaches the nuclear bomb, other states in the region are already prepared to do the same. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt even. So definitely this is going to open the door for further nuclearization in the region. And it's just not talk, they are already preparing for that in many ways. So it is like, at the moment we have militarization, like it's like a security dilemma. One state is increasing its power, other states have to do the same. It's exactly the same logic as well in the nuclearization. How this is going to evolve, there are many, many variables that are present at the moment, but eventually there needs to be some sort of a normative agreement that brings states together. But as we see it right now, more nuclear powers will be more, and there will be more competition. The way the regional system is set at the moment, it's a multipolar system. There is no hegemon. And in that state, no state is capable of actually imposing any rules to the game. And Rafaela, thank you so much. I think I totally agree with your reading of Walt. Walt was a neorealist, and he saw, or he basically found that pure neorealism does not work, and he had to include this perception. And he included that in his element of aggressive intentions, how states perceive aggressive intentions. And that was definitely a deviation from the pure neorealist thinking. Nevertheless, he didn't really follow up on that. So even though he acknowledged it in the book, but he didn't really have, let's say, a fully fledged analysis of perceptions. So in a way, he was like, one side in, but one side still a neorealist. And that's what opened the door for Barnett's work, where they said, okay, we actually have to take the perception and the threat seriously and adopt a constructivist reading of the same phenomenon. And I mean, I totally agree with you on authoritarianism. In the book, for example, I don't really talk about states or state institutions. I rather talk about regimes as my main unit of analysis. And by regimes, I mean the main leaders that take the decisions, but also the network that support them, the coalitions that come to support them in power. And that's the reality in the Middle East, that most of the states and the institutions are rather absorbed and captured by regimes, which are elites coming from colonial history, but also coming from different decolonization processes related to the coup d'etat. Several coup d'etat in the region established, for example, military institutions. So in many cases, those who are making the decisions might be armies, military institutions, like Egypt, or as was the case in Libya, or as was the case in Yemen. In many other cases, it's a monarchy, like the Gulf countries. In other cases, it might be an individual that's taking over power, like Saddam Hussein, for example, in Iraq, or it might be a political party, like in Syria. So Syria, for example, is a case where it's often mistaken as an individual leader really taking over the decision. It's not the case. Hafez al-Assad was more or less relying on the party and relying on a network of leaders from the party that's supporting him and supporting his endeavors at domestic and foreign policy levels. And we cannot really discount that. So in that sense, definitely these decisions or the dynamics of threat perceptions in the Middle East are very, very different from, let's say, threat perceptions in Europe. Definitely, let's say the military balance of power could be similar. Some factors are similar, but there are also different dynamics in who's making those decision-making, but also who is mobilizing the people behind these decisions. And you talked about identity and how identity sometimes is used to mobilize the people behind these decisions. But also it doesn't mean that identity, because it's fluid and it's easy to change the narrative, it doesn't mean that they can do it all the time. Identity also can be a constraint. So as much as it provides leaders with opportunities to do these shifts and changes, it also provides them with constraints. And just the example that we're talking about whether Saudi Arabia is going to have a peace agreement with Israel or not, it's a pure example of how identity might end up being a constraint rather than an opportunity.
Thank you. One last question. The second one. Okay, go ahead.
This is Liv again. I wanted to ask about, again, identity. So we live in a time, right, with the internet where all of us, we have the choice, or we're subject to lots of different identities that we could possibly choose from, right? And you mentioned like the influence of Saudi Arabia and of a more strict interpretation of Islam, and at the same time, globally, we experience the Pride movement, different feminist movement, and how do you think that a country? Because I think about Egypt and the feminist that was arrested at a concert for showing the Pride flag. How do you think this pluralism of identities can undermine a national identity, or what does it do to the young people who live in a country that maybe they don't identify with anymore at all because of they have values that are not represented by their society or their government?
Thank you very much. It's an excellent question, and it's at the very heart of the discussion about identity, because again, part of the fluidity of the identity, that identities have different sources, and one actor can hold multiple identity, and that's one of the characteristics of identities, that they don't exist in singular. They're always different, and it depends on the circumstances and the context. So as you cited the case of Egypt, for example, Egypt could be a nationalist or stress its nationalist identity by saying Egypt first, but it could be also Arab, it could be African, it could be Mediterranean, and it could be Middle Eastern, and or Muslim. And in many of these cases, it depends on the situation and it depends on who the other is. So Egypt, for example, in its conflict with Ethiopia over the Nile, it's stressing very much its African identity. It's all about Africa. It's all about our place in Africa and our role in Africa. But when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's an Arab identity and it's about being Arab. But also it could be, when it comes to the immigration issue in Europe, it's a Mediterranean country. So in many of the cases, you see that actors can switch these parts of identity. It could happen at the state level, but as you said, it could also happen at the sub-state level, individual level, group level. And one individual can have, if you think about yourself, every individual has several identities, and you can switch between one or the other depending on the situation. Now the problem happens if that switch or an activation of one identity might contradict another identity that you have. So for example, being an Egyptian, but also at the same time, you have a loyalty, or you identify more with a sub-state identity by saying, well, I don't belong to Egypt. I don't identify with the official narrative of who an Egyptian is. Or you just provide an alternative interpretation, and that's the case of many Egyptians at the moment. They still believe that they're Egyptian, but official narrative coming from the regime simply does not represent them. And they say, well, being an Egyptian actually means something else for them. And they don't identify with the official interpretation that's coming from the regime. And that's usually the clash. And that's where the negotiations over identities happen between societies and regime, between different groups. And it's not just a very clear-cut agreement. It's rather about the different interpretation. And if you read, for example, the book of Michael Barnett about dialogues in Arab politics, he was saying the main problem in the Arab world that every state defined Arabism in a different way. They had different interpretation, and the divide was over which interpretation is the legitimate one. And that's exactly the same what happens in societies. So it's not even sometimes about multiple identity, it might be the multiple interpretation of one single identity that causes the conflicts.
Excellent. May, thank you so much. We have to close now. For all the participants, the ones that are present, please join me in thanking Dr. May Darwish for her excellent presentation. And for the virtual ones, you can clap virtually. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me and for the excellent questions. I think these are the most fascinating questions I've got on the book talk. So I'm really pleased and I really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, May.
Thank you.
And I hope, inshallah, we'll see each other soon.
Yes, soon, inshallah.